What did VC funding enable your business to do that you wouldn't have done without?
Innovation that we simply wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. We get to work with some of the most spectacularly interesting concepts and materials on the planet, many of which are still highly secret, but it brought us the ability to do that.
Welcome to the investment season of How to Start Up, a podcast for anyone starting or scaling a company. Hosted by me, Juliet Fallowfield, founder of B Corp certified PR, communications and podcasting consultancy, Fallowfield & Mason, where we teach you how to own your PR in-house. Raising investment can be a daunting process, especially if you've never done it before. So for our 9th season, you'll hear from successful founders and entrepreneurs on what we should be doing now, next or never when considering investment. It has been reported that the value of UK venture capital deals in quarters 1 to 3 of this year fell by 43% year on year, while the number fell by 25.9% in the same period. However, VC deals are still being struck by innovative businesses. In this episode, I speak with Steve Tidball, co-founder and CEO of Vollebak, the materials science-driven clothing brand. Having co-founded it in 2015 with his twin brother Nick, the brand has raised over 10 million in outside funding, led by the London-based venture firm Venrex, with participation from Airbnb co-founder Joe Gebbia and Headspace CFO Sean Brecker, among others. This has allowed Vollebak to create the world's first solar charged jacket and the first computer programmable clothing. Given the uncertainty around raising VC investment, Steve offers his valuable advice on the best ways to pitch to a VC fund and shares how his business has used VC investment to scale. Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for your time on How to Start Up today. Before we get into everything about pitching to a VC, it would be great if you could introduce yourself and a bit about the business that you've started.
Okay, of course, yes. Hello. So I am the CEO and co-founder, along with my twin brother, of a brand called Vollebak. And very simply, we make clothes that look like they're from the future. And what that means essentially is we not only use the world's most novel materials, but we make clothes that solve some of the most pressing challenges we face as a species, from climate change and resource scarcity to space exploration. And I come from a background of branding, but I've rapidly moved into a world of, building a business is trickier than just building a brand. And so that's my background. And we've been doing it for about 6 years. We've won quite a lot of awards. We have some very cool customers. And it has been, I describe it as going on a roller coaster without wearing any of the safety harnesses.
I would 100% agree with that analogy, and congratulations, because you have built the most incredible brand. And on the outside, it looks, excuse the pun, but seamless and perfect. But I know behind the scenes, you will have been slogging your guts out to get this where it is today. And presumably working at that level isn't cheap, and you would have had to go after investment. So could you give us a little bit of background as to how you've gone on after funding, or how you've even funded it?
Yes, I started the first 15 years of my career. I worked in advertising as a creative director for some of the world's largest and coolest brands. One of my heroes at the time was the guys who built Innocent. And one of them started in advertising, and I heard about an email he'd sent originally when he was pitching for money for Innocent. And he just emailed his entire network, and the email said, "Who knows rich people?" And so I thought, it's a great idea. I'll just do that. And one of the fantastic things about advertising is you do build up an incredible network of people. It is filled with highly talented, skilled people, many of whom have very wide networks. I'd spent 15 years building my network in that industry, so we came with some credibility. And so we were lucky enough to be introduced to some incredibly inspiring, clever, and also wealthy people. I actually ended up pitching a couple of my bosses. I worked as part of a really enormous network that looked after companies like Apple. And so you had some of the world's greatest marketeers in there. They were excited by the idea. They introduced me to their friends. But we really started it with such naivety.
You wouldn't do it any other way, though. If someone said, if you told me then what I'd have had to do to get here today, I wouldn't have done it. Ignorance is bliss. Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. I think you have to be, if you're not embarrassed by your early days, then you probably weren't trying hard enough or running fast enough. And so we really hadn't figured out quite what money we'd need. We hadn't figured out any of the timings. We didn't have relationships with any factories. And we had some incredibly well-meaning investors potential investors who went to see it first, who said, you might need some numbers in here. You might need a spreadsheet.
This is day one. This is right at the beginning.
Day one raising money. We'd gone very brand heavy. in the end, we raised a relatively small amount of money, like a couple of £100, just to make a few products, just to prove the principle, just to say, look, if we make clothes that feel like they're from the next century, there might be something interesting here. Now, we didn't necessarily make the clothing that we should have made, but what we did make is we made clothing to get attention. And so our very first product was a pink hoodie, quite bright pink, that zipped up over your face. And it was called a relaxation hoodie. And it was based off of some quite interesting scientific principles based on this color was designed to slow down your heart rate and your brain waves. And it encouraged you to breathe through your nose. And it came with a pink noise soundtrack. It was really quite odd and original. But it ended up, a comedian took it on Jimmy Fallon. And so that was the largest TV show in the world at the time. And the cost of that marketing was £47 to send him a couple of hoodies. And that was enough to convince more people, oh, hang on, there might be something here. Because those first two pieces of clothing we designed would never have got through any focus group in a million years. But that's not what we were trying to do. We were trying to set out to solve challenges that no one was thinking about. And at that time, we were thinking about, could a piece of clothing interact with your sympathetic nervous system?
That sounds expensive from a funding perspective. So you really need capital from the get-go.
We really did. Once we proved that principle, and then we got into the world very quickly of material science, yes, you need capital, because what you really need is you need the infrastructure within your company to be able to go after and develop the world's most interesting materials, to go after products, some of which will be commercial in their nature and some won't, and you won't actually know. And we also, in the early days, had to be willing to tolerate a fairly high level of failure, which if anyone who's running a clothing business, you know that's not what you want to tolerate.
Anyone running any startup has to get very comfortable with failure very quickly and just accept that it's part of your everyday. But with funding, there's a lot of glossy, hyped up words that it comes to investment. I work in a co-working place. I've never gone after investment. So I look at it from the outside in, and you hear angels and friends and family, seed round, and then you hear VCs and funds, and it's an awful economic climate. Lots of jargon. When it comes to VC, could you give us your perspective on what is a VC?
First of all, you have to start with the idea that they're human beings. And
are they though?
They are. I think they all are. But I think what marks them out as slightly different is that they have a typically much more strict investment philosophy. And they are, on the whole, or the very good ones, are exceptional pattern recognizers. They're phenomenal at saying, what you're doing here fits into a pattern that I know and understand already. And so, whereas if you look at angels, for instance, which is typically wealthy individuals, they might invest more on passion projects or gut instinct, or something they just like the look of, or it's just something that they buy into. VCs are different. I don't think you're ever going to get a venture capitalist who goes, oh yeah, I just really like it. It doesn't make any sense to me, but my gut feel says it's okay. They just don't really work like that. It was interesting. Like when we first started on our investment journey, I too had never heard the word venture capitalist, literally never heard of it. So I didn't even know to approach them because I didn't even know they existed. So I simply went after my bucket, which was people with cash, rich people, because I'm going to find some of them. Now, as it happens, you do end up finding some venture capital people, and there's lots of them invest privately as well. About 6 years ago, I absolutely could not have come on this podcast because I don't know the difference between, a seed round and friends and family and a venture capital round. The thing that I've learned over the last 6 years, though, and I definitely learned in a sort of a much longer career in advertising before, because I'm in my mid-40s now, is that you're simply chatting to some other human beings over the other side of the table. And it's really about understanding what does that human being need to hear and see in order to do the thing that I want. So human nature doesn't really change particularly across these different silos that we think about people in. They just, when it comes to venture capital, they just have a much stricter philosophy. So you'll find people who only invest in AI or only invest in agri-tech, whatever it is that they're into, or sustainability or a climate fund. And however good your idea is, if that fund doesn't match what you're doing, it's utterly irrelevant.
A lot of people talk about friends and family rounds, seed rounds, Series A, blah, blah, blah. Can you go straight to VC from the get-go? Or do you have to follow a bit of a system of who you go to first for investment?
There's no hard and fast rules. I think you can definitely go to venture capital first. I think certainly Silicon Valley has a far better track record of those things than perhaps trying that in London. So you will follow a traditional pattern, typically. And it's because you have to think about them as ecosystems that interrelate. Almost like those cartoons where you have a little fish being eaten by a slightly bigger fish, being eaten by an even bigger fish, and you can swim your way up the food chain. But of course, you can absolutely circumvent that whole system and go straight to venture capital. So let's say, for argument's sake, let's say that I've invented the new, ChatGPT, and it's 10 times faster and 10 times more predictive. Great. I can go straight to any venture capital firm in the world and go, I've got this, here's the data that backs it up, and you will get a big bag of money handed to you.
And that's because VCs are the biggest cheeses in this whole pie. They're the ones with the biggest chunks of money that they can...
No, you can swim up the river from there and you can get into private equity, who are even bigger players. VC absolutely represents a relatively small part of the entire investment world. I'm going to get it wrong, but I think it's something like 3%. It's really small. And these are the people who are willing to take typically earlier and relatively speculative risks. From my experience, or certainly for the people I chat to, by the time you get into private equity, they're not willing to take the kind of risks that venture capital will want to take. And then typically, if you come down from venture capital and you get into angel investing, you actually get people taking much larger risks, but not always knowing that they're taking enormous risks. So a venture capitalist will always, typically, I'd say, have quite a good understanding of the amount of risk that they're willing to tolerate, because they have a really firm understanding of the amount of return they're looking to get. I've always believed that rules are there to be broken. I would say, though, that if you are going to go straight to venture capital, which is obviously what a lot of people do in the Valley, you're climbing into bed straight away with some incredibly powerful people. And unless you have really stunning brain power or willpower or experience, it is quite likely that things might be wrestled out of your control quite quickly. And it's been fascinating to watch the sort of the crash and burn of some of these highly spectacular companies in Silicon Valley, where extremely young people have been given, whether it's Theranos or the Sam Bankman-Fried stuff, relatively young people have been given extraordinary amounts of money and then left to go. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we have to differentiate, probably when we're talking about these worlds, between maybe Silicon Valley and the rest of the world.
Sure.
Because if you're in London and you're constantly watching what happens in the Valley, it's like setting up a tech company and looking at what Facebook are doing. There might be absolutely no correlation because you're just so fundamentally different. So I think recognizing where you actually sit today and what you might need, so it might feel very cool to say, I'm going after venture capital funding, but it might just be impossible. And actually you might just need 100 grand and you might want to do a crowdfunding raise, for instance, which might raise it far quicker.
And for you, at what point in your 6 years of your brand did you realize and recognize that you needed to go after VC?
Actually, it was entirely organic. We had taken only in private investment to that point, and one of those private investors introduced me to someone who happened to be in venture capital, and we got on really well. So we didn't actually make a conscious choice of now we're going after venture money. We simply had a warm introduction to someone who I got on incredibly well with. I then took some advice from a friend of mine who's within the industry but not connected to my company, essentially, and said, look, we're thinking of essentially transitioning from being purely angel funded, essentially, to having venture capital money in. And I said, do I need to be thinking about this differently? And he said, not really. They've just got to pass the flatmate test, which is, would you be their flatmate? When you come back after a hard day at work, are they going to have eaten your sandwich? And is the bathroom going to be a mess? Because if it is, then they're not the people you want. And that was probably one of the best bits of advice I've ever had. Because so many people will be so quick to say it's about the term sheet, it's about the valuation, it's about control, it's about all of these other things. But ultimately, the way I look at it is you're going to spend quite a significant period of your life with this person. They're going to be involved in some of the biggest decisions you've ever made. And I just don't think you're going to look back and go, brilliant, I'm glad I got all the things I wanted on the term sheet, when actually you're stuck in a difficult conversation and you have fundamentally opposing personalities. That's going to be
with them for a while as well. It's not like a colleague or a team member that you have to manage out of the business. You're stuck with them.
Absolutely. And their job is to see you through to some kind of exit. And I think you always have to be really conscious of that up front, because again, when you take money from, let's say you take money from your mum and dad, right? Your mum and dad are not going to be forcing you to IPO.
Well, it depends on who they are, but yeah.
But you're likely to come under less pressure. Whereas when you sign up with people who are in venture capital, they have periods of time in which they have to return money to investors. They have an amount that they want to return. They've only got a set number of businesses with which to return that money. So they're highly motivated that you become one of the companies that does it.
Succeed, which can be a good thing and a bad thing, but you need to like them. You need to be able to communicate with them. Is there a preferred way to pitch to a VC that would be different from another investor?
There's some very basic human stuff, which if you can present yourself and the story about your company in an incredibly coherent and compelling way, you have their attention. And if you can do that in the first 30 seconds, you've really got their attention. I think if you can't do that, I think it's incredibly unlikely. You or your business, and ideally both, have to connect with that person where they go, oh, there's something here. Yeah. Because ultimately, if they do like you and if they do like your business, there's going to be so many things down the line that they have to check. You have to meet their partners. You have to go through due diligence. You have to do there's all sorts of hoops that you will have to jump through, but you're never going to get close to those hoops if in that first, let's say 30 seconds is too aggressive, although I think it is actually true.
No, I think it's one breath. And this is how we train our PR clients with pitching to an editor. If they need to be able to describe what they're doing in one breath. It's not an elevator pitch anymore. You've got such a short attention span of people.
I would agree with that, which is why very early on I wrote the line closed from the future, because you just go, I want to know what that is. It has enough in it where you go, ooh, but also enough left out that you go, so what is that? Yeah. And so it forces that intrigue. And I think that's really critical, because you then, once you've got past that first, this person is sane, likable, I trust them, and the idea is good, then you have to really be able to spell out incredibly clearly what it is you're attempting to do, why that's going to work, and on what timescale that's going to work. One of my tips would actually be, it's really valuable having trained in another industry first. And specifically in advertising, we're trained to basically create really compelling messages in really short periods of time with as few words as possible. And then once you've got their attention, yes, sure, there's probably a 100-page deck behind it or a 15-page deck that then illustrates that. But it's just like a great headline in an ad or a great trailer for a film. You have to leave them wanting to know more.
It has to get you to the next step. And there's so many similarities to pitching to an editor here, because that first email should not have the entire brand biography, founder story, 10 million high res. The first email just needs to get you a reply. The reply just needs to get you to the pitch. The pitch needs to get you to a coffee. And eventually, after all of those steps are followed through, the coverage will come out. But you're not going to get coverage from that first email. It sounds like with investors, that first 30 seconds, that first impression, where they sort of almost on your team and they're like, I like this person, I want to support them. What's next? And then you give them the next nugget.
I couldn't agree more. I do actually think there is such a huge crossover between the sort of the communications industries and the ability to then pitch to these people.
Pitching is pitching. And a lot of people have said when you're running a startup, whether you like it or not, 80% of your job is sales. And it's just being able to communicate your business.
And let's say I'm a venture capitalist and I turn the tables for a minute. And let's say someone comes in and they can't actually really tell me who they are or what they're attempting to do. I just think, how on earth are you going to build a website that says what you do? How on earth are you going to create advertising to create awareness that tells people what you do? If you can't tell me in 10 words or under, then how on earth are you going to actually communicate to an audience? There's very few companies in the world where you don't effectively have to use a short number of words to tell the world what you do. Yeah. Whether you're Disney or Apple, it's the same rules for absolutely everybody.
You're preaching to the converted. This is brilliant. Thank you for validating my business model as well.
And I think once you've understood that, then there's plenty of books on understanding what venture capitalists are after. Really, the key thing is understanding that they are after a return in a set period of time and that they're taking bets. And their bets say 1 out of 10 of their businesses will fail, or 9 out of 10 businesses will fail. However, if they get the one, Facebook or Google or whatever it is, then they're okay. Mm-hmm. So it's really worthwhile understanding their world, because otherwise you're just pitching so blind. Mm. It's like it's going to be incredibly difficult unless you really understand what they're after.
Flipping it the other way, how much attention should a founder pay to a VC's fund portfolio or performance record? Like, how much due diligence should the founder do on the VC?
So I think it's really interesting because lots of founders will go after the most spectacular fund, the one that's got Airbnb, Google, Uber 10 years ago on its books. My personal belief is that it's more critical that you have a brilliant relationship with the key stakeholder in that venture capital firm that you're actually going to have a relationship with. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, let's say a venture capital firm has backed Google. That's just a one-of-a-kind company. It's very unlikely that you are Google. And their track record there is both interesting but also irrelevant. Because let's say you're building the next Google and you're building something incredibly similar. That's vital. Because then you go, here is a partner on my team that has amazing track record experience in building a company just like this. Mm. So I think that can be really valuable. But I think that's a very different story from, here are 10 really impressive brands, but none of them are anything like us. You have to question how much value is that person going to add, because what they're going to be really good at is having seen the journey of 10 brands that are nothing like yours. Then you're relying on, is there amazing crossover knowledge to be gained from those brands? Possibly, if you're doing some kind of overlay strategy where you're taking the kind of the concept from one market and putting it to another market, and maybe they've got deep expertise in that market that you're taking from, brilliant. So I think there's so many questions you have to ask yourself beyond, oh, wow, they've got 8 unicorns on their books, I'm going to be a unicorn. It's really not how it works, because there's so much chance in it. We're lucky enough, like one of our investors is Joe Gebbia, who helped build one of the 3 founders of Airbnb. But if you look at what happened during maybe COVID, and they had to take on $2 billion in funding really rapidly. So Airbnb could really quickly have gone from a story, this massive success story, to actually it folded during COVID because they're renting out people's homes and no one can travel anywhere. And then you'd then be judging a VC who had invested in Airbnb, and it would have looked like Airbnb had failed, but of course it hadn't. It would have been subject to a black swan event.
But also amazing that he's someone that can help you in a crisis, because every startup's going to have a crisis.
That's the one thing you're guaranteed of.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say that I think is probably one of the most useful things I've done is read the written histories of some of the most famous brand builders in history and read them over and over again. So I've done that a lot with Disney, Apple, and Nike are my 3 particular favorites. What it shows you is on the outside, these are these massive Goliaths of American industry. And on the inside, it is crisis follows crisis. So I think really understanding that early is really key, because otherwise you go in and go, oh my God, I've got a crisis. You go, well, of course you have, because you've got a business. So that's what it's going to be. And so I think that's the other thing that we learned really early that I probably advise people to do, is really go and read how those businesses worked. Because it will really help you decide, do you want to jump into business?
In terms of looking for support from people, if you have VC funding, how involved could they be? Could they be people to help you out in a crisis? Are they there to act as almost like a mentor? Or is every single person different in this relationship?
Yeah, I think it's utterly dependent on the type of fund and the type of person that you pick. So I have friends who run businesses, and the VCs are literally in the businesses. But these could be giant businesses where they're operating hand in hand. There will be other venture capital that's relatively hands off. So I don't think there is a one size fits all, simply because the VC business is so varied from country to country, from industry to industry. I think that's a really key thing to understand when you're choosing people. And that really does come back to the flatmate test.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, let's say that they decide that they need to be really hands-on for a time period. For various, maybe the business is going through a crisis, maybe there's some kind of black swan event in culture or in thing that you need hand. If they're a good flatmate, that's okay. They could come and work in your office, and that's going to be okay. But let's say they've failed the flatmate test and they were a hands-off VC, and then trouble hits and they become a hands-on VC. Well, that's going to be less than ideal, I would imagine.
Someone else said this about, would you go for a beer with them after work, or would you invite them to your wedding? So the flatmate beer and wedding thing, I think it's all very similar.
I think they have to be, because I think if you think about it in sort of lifespans, they're almost going to be there at the birth of the business and at the marriage and at the death.
Yeah.
That's the reality. So when you do finally exit a business, for instance, it will be with very heavy steering and involvement from any venture capital fund that's involved.
This could be a very naive question to ask. If you take on VC's funding, do you have to exit at some point? for them to get the return?
There has to be some kind of event.
Yeah.
It could be a partial sale, a full sale, an IPO, an industry buyout. So they will have to return their money at some point. I'm not an expert in the history of venture capital. There may be businesses that lie outside of that. So if you take SpaceX, for instance, I think there'll be a fairly high level of confidence in anyone investing in that maybe that's not a 3-year return. However, the return will be so spectacular, maybe they'll wait for 20 years, for instance. But then, especially in the Valley and in LA, you do get funds that very specifically go after really long range ambitions, where they're highly capitalized and they can have a much longer time horizon, where they go actually over 10 to 20 years. They're probably more outliers. I think most people are looking 3, 5, 7 years at those kind of things. Knowing that up front is so important, though, because you're effectively getting into bed with that aim.
Someone said to me very early on, and this is something we say to our clients as well, 2 different conversations. What does success look like to you? Why are you doing this? It's like, well, I did it because I was made redundant and I just wanted to keep a roof above my head. And now I want to run a business. And they're like, well, is it a lifestyle or are you going to sell it? I was like, I had not even considered that. I woke up, started a business, hit the ground running, which is not the normal way of doing it. And it's not the advised way of doing it. But I think if you're really honest with what you're doing this for, what is your end goal here? And it just shapes all of your decisions throughout your day to day. And it really helps. But especially when investment, people are going to be asking you that, aren't you? They're going to be saying, what are you going to be doing in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? But do you know the answers to those questions?
Yes, because I've been asked them lots. So I've thought about it really long and hard, which is when I get to the end of my life, I want to look back and say that I built something truly extraordinary that changed the industry I was in. That's it. Amazing. That's quite big, but I think we're going to get there. The reality is we're already doing things that no one else has ever done before. And for a relatively small startup in the middle of London, working in an industry that I had no experience in, that's already quite interesting that we could be looked at by some of the biggest players and that we're changing stuff. So yes, that's my single thing. It's not necessarily the end slide on a VC pitch of like, when I'm on my deathbed, I want to have done this, but it orientates me. It's the thing where I go, you have to have some kind of North Star or Grand Canyon or whatever it is you're aiming for. You know that you're heading in that direction. But at the same time, there has to be a scalable business there.
And what did VC funding enable your business to do that you wouldn't have done without? Innovation that we simply wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
We get to work with some of the most spectacularly interesting concepts and materials on the planet, many of which are still highly secret and we've not brought out. But it brought us the ability to do that. Before, we were essentially very nicely relying on charm to get things done. And the reality is charm will get you so far, but at some point you're going to need some kind of capital. And so my brother and I would fly out to factories, literally get down on bended knees to persuade various people in Portugal or Italy to make things for us or sell us their fabrics or even work with us. And when you have some money, innovation becomes easier and innovation is valuable to us because it sits at the core of our company. What we're trying to do is we're trying to merge clothing and technology. I think there's an incredibly valuable space there. I think we're doing something completely unique and novel, and therefore that has value. But there is also a capital requirement quite clearly to do those kind of things. And especially if we're asking clothing to do things that it hasn't done before. If we're asking it to try and turn invisible or protect you from diseases or resist a flaming meteor, I can't just turn up to Canada Goose or Lululemon and hope that it's going to do the trick. It isn't. And that requires money. And the backing of venture allowed us to do that. Fundamentally changes the nature of our company. It makes it more valuable, essentially.
Huge congratulations, because what you're doing is so exciting to see, this disruptor coming through. That's the thing, when you're doing something that hasn't been done before, you make your life so much harder for yourself. But when it works, it's so much more rewarding. Actually, on that, what we do is have a question from the previous guest to ask the next guest. And we would like to ask you a question for our next guest as well.
Oh, gosh, okay.
So Laura, who we interviewed before, she is the founder of Monk, which I was describing it as an ergonomically delicious ice bath. And it's a thing of beauty, but obviously incredible mental and physical health benefits. Her question was, in those dark days when you have obstacle after obstacle thrown at you, what do you do to pull yourself out of that bad mindset?
I run barefoot as fast as I can in nature, because I have a fundamental belief that your subconscious brain is far more capable of solving challenges than your conscious brain is. And so I try and pull myself out of a conscious state and move myself into a subconscious problem solving state. What this actually consists of in reality is, I run barefoot. I try to run with as few clothes on as possible, which is normally possible in England during the summer.
Yeah.
And I run until I'm running so hard I can't actually think anymore.
You switch your brain off.
That just switches your brain off.
Yeah.
And then typically I find that my mind will probably solve some of those challenges that I thought were impossible.
So it's another form of meditation in a way.
Yeah, I do a lot of meditation as well. But what I've found, and the reason that's my specific answer to that question, is what I've found is that it's very easy to have a fight or flight response to those kind of crises, where you can interpret, let's say, a cash crisis or someone quitting or whatever it is. You can interpret that as, or your body can, as a tiger is chasing me. The classic fight and flight response. But of course, a tiger isn't chasing you. Actually, what's happened is something bad that's affected you emotionally that may affect your business. But it's very rare that you are under actual physical threat. So the reason I move into a very physical space is to remind me this is what something physical actually feels like. So it's a kind of tripwire in your brain to go, no, you're just under an emotional threat, not under a physical threat. So that's what I like to do.
And also the endorphins, presumably from a good run, help as well.
Yeah, so it's a very positive coping mechanism.
Yeah. And what would your question be for our next guest? And it could be anything around starting a business or investment.
Oh, well, her question was absolutely fantastic. I would like to throw my deathbed question back, actually. I would like to know when this next person who's answering this question knows that they've reached the end of their life, what are they going to look back on and be proud that they built? Because I find it such an orientating question, because the answer to that question I don't think it can be, oh, I sold my business for 100 million. I think it has to be something more interesting and more profound with some kind of human truth attached to it.
I completely agree. Completely agree, because it's definitely on the bar chart of job satisfaction, where I used to negotiate a base salary and a bonus. There's so many other things that matter now. And it's people, reward, brain activation, conversations I get to have, freedom, autonomy, all the stuff. And then obviously you need revenue to exist. And when we became B Corp, we learned obviously you have to be profitable to be able to put people and planet above profit, but you need profit there. So it's important, but it's not by any means at all the most important. Now, I'm really impressed with that. I will let you know what they say. But thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting to chat to you.
Thank you ever so much.
If you'd like to contact Steve, you can find all of his details in the show notes, along with a recap of the advice that he has so kindly shared. Thank you for listening to How to Start Up. I hope these conversations offer you some confidence, encouragement, and reassurance that you're on the right track. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I'd be so appreciative if you were to rate, review, and subscribe, as it will really help other people starting a company discover it.